Now I'd like to give the floor to Professor RAQUEL Barradas de Freitas, visiting professor at the Católica School of Law and the Nova School of Law in Lisbon, and advisor to the President of Portugal's Constitutional Court. Professor Barradas de Freitas was awarded a doctorate in law by Oxford University 10 years ago, with a thesis entitled Explaining Meaning Towards a Minimalist Account of Legal Interpretation. She was a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, and research lecturer and lecturer in jurisprudence at Trinity College, University of Oxford. She has also coordinated the book Trust Matters, Cross-Disciplinary Essays, and she proposed the title The Raisons of Trust, a title that sounds familiar to a philosopher. What are the reasons for trust? What is the difference between trust and authority, trust and commitment? I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning. So a quick word of thanks before I begin, if I may. I could not be more delighted to be here today among so many colleagues whose work I admire. And a special thank you to the group of scholars and their team who planned, organized, and made this conference possible. In particular, but not restricted to, of course, Céline Romainville, Frédéric Bouon, Julien Charenne, Mathias Elberoumi, Léna Geron, and Fanny Sterck. Congratulations on your work on this very interesting, ambitious, and really valuable project. Okay, so I'm also just a philosopher, actually, and so my paper will be very abstract. I won't have any slides, but I hope I'll be able to speak in a way that's not difficult to follow. So the theme of this conference is political institutions in search of trust. And of course, a few questions, as Lina said at the beginning, immediately come to mind, right? Are political institutions actually in search of trust?
Raquel, could you speak closer?
Yes, sorry. Is this better? Okay,
yes.
Thank you. Are political institutions actually in search of trust? Should they be? Whose trust do they crave? Have they lost it? Why have they lost it? And why do they or should they seek to restore it? I will, of course, set such questions aside for the moment because I believe some of our colleagues will be addressing them in the course of this conference. But what I'd like to note is that the theme of this conference circumscribes the focus of our discussion in a very helpful way. Trust takes many forms and shapes, and it would not be possible to address them or explore them all here. Interpersonal or intimate trust differs from social and civic or political trust in very salient ways, and it differs from trust in institutions in very salient ways. There are also many possible angles of analysis of the concept of trust, from psychology, social psychology included, and the cognitive sciences more generally, to political science, political philosophy, political theory, behavioral economics, as Professor Lachlan has just told us, sociology, law, and philosophy, of course, and within philosophy, from epistemology to the philosophy of action, to ethics, legal and political philosophy, and even the philosophy of mind. So there are so many possible angles of analysis. The small contribution that I would like to make today is to help frame debates about the place of trust in public life by tidying up, so to speak, the rather messy conceptual toolbox that trust scholars have at their disposal. The sharper the tools we use, the better our understanding of our object, right? And as one contemporary philosopher notes, concepts are the instruments of thought. We use them like surgical instruments for dissecting, like scientific instruments for observing and measuring, and like musical instruments for inventing and imagining, all at once. So, Trust can be studied as an attitude, as a social practice, and as a virtue, right? Trust is all of these things. Each of these aspects of trust will require the choice of certain methods of analysis. Today, I wish to make the following claim. It is not possible to understand the place of trust in different domains, including public and political life, without understanding trust as a reason-giving attitude or practice. It is not possible, I think, to understand trust and address challenges to it, if that's what we want to do, without understanding what I call the reasons of trust. So I will talk to you a little bit about the reasons of trust. And by this, I mean reasons that trust gives us for action and for belief. And such reasons are reasons that we have to 𝐹 or to believe X, something, by virtue either of trusting someone or of being trusted by someone. Now, a quick note about 𝐹. In philosophy, the symbol 𝐹, which is the 21st letter of the modern Greek alphabet, stands for a generic act. So any act. When I use the word 𝐹 in my remarks, you can replace it in your imagination with any action verb that you can think of. Okay, so this is just a little note. So my remarks will be in 4 parts. I will start by briefly distinguishing reasons of trust, the center of these remarks, from reasons for trust and reasons to trust. I will then distinguish reasons from trust, very briefly, of course, from reasons of authority, which is a central concept in legal theory and in political philosophy, of course. I will argue very briefly that trust and authority are distinct. I will next assume, not argue, that trust is a relationship. The suggestion that follows is that we need a thick account of trust if we are to distinguish trust from authority and from other types of reason-giving relationship. I then propose a thick account of trust with the concepts of vulnerability, commitment, responsiveness, and reciprocity at its core. And of course, I will not be offering you a fully worked out, thick account of trust. My aim today is just to show what a conceptual frame for such an account might look like. And finally, I will conclude with an overview of what trust is not, according to this thick view, and a final very brief note on trust and the rule of law. Okay, so one way of rehearsing the idea that reasons of trust are distinct from reasons for or reasons to trust might be to say that reasons of trust are normative reasons, not motivating reasons. But I think this would not be correct. Trust can give us reasons for action or belief, which are both normative and motivating, right? And reasons for trust and reasons to trust can do the same. So I think the distinction between motivating and normative reasons, though very important and useful in other contexts, is not very helpful here. So by reasons of trust, I mean, and I repeat, reasons that A has to 𝐹, to do something, or to believe X, by virtue of her trust in B. So we have A and B, the two parties in the trust relationship. But also reasons that B has to 𝐹, or to believe something, by virtue of being trusted by A. These are normative reasons, or motivating reasons, that A and B would otherwise not have to 𝐹. These are reasons generated by trust, right? Now compare this kind of reason that I've just described to you with reasons for trust, which I define very roughly as reasons for cultivating an attitude or the relationship or virtue of trust. And with reasons to trust, which I define as reasons which explain or justify A's trust in B to 𝐹. We can say that A trusts B because A believes B is reliable, competent, well-meaning, takes A's interests to heart, always has given A reasons to believe that he's trustworthy, knows A, cares about A, a variety of possible reasons, right? Or we could say that A trusts B because B is actually reliable, competent, well-meaning, etc. Here are 2 examples of sentences of both sorts. A ought to trust B to babysit let's imagine, because B is trustworthy. Another type of sentence of this sort is A trusts B to babysit because B comes highly recommended, right? A reason to trust can be a belief or an emotion. A has faith in B. But it can also be a state of affairs, right? A and B have been in a close, healthy relationship for years, for example. So an account of reasons of trust, I want to say, is necessary, though not sufficient, to a proper understanding of trust across domains, right? Across domains. Reasons of trust are the kernel of trust. Reasons for and reasons to trust are also, of course, part of a comprehensive account of trust, but my claim here is that it is not possible to understand what distinguishes trust from other attitudes or relationships without accepting that there is such a thing as what I call non-contingent, distinctive reasons of trust. So here are 4 examples of these reasons, non-contingent, distinctive reasons of trust. A's trust in B to phi gives A a reason not to phi herself. So for example, if I trust my daughter to walk our dog this afternoon, I now have a reason not to walk our dog myself this afternoon. Another example, A's trust in B to phi gives A a reason not to consider alternatives to B in phiing. For example, if I trust a particular team member to complete a particular task, I have a reason not to ask other team members to do the same. Another example, A's trust in B gives A a reason to believe that B will phi. For example, if I ask you, why do you believe they will pay the bill when payment is due? And you reply, because I trust them to pay their bills when payment is due. And finally, A's trust in B gives B a reason to phi. This is a particularly important example, I think. The trust I place in my babysitter to collect my daughter from school on Tuesday afternoon gives the babysitter an additional reason, perhaps a weightier reason, to do that, to collect my child on Tuesday afternoon. So an interesting question at this juncture is whether the trusted person needs to know they're trusted in order for my account of the reasons of trust to work. The answer is, I think, no, because reasons of trust emerge both in cases of actual trust and in cases of role or relationship-based expectations of trust. These are cases in which the parties are in a relationship or occupy a role to which trust or trustworthiness are typically or conventionally associated. So, for example, A may be expected to trust a parent when in fact they justifiably don't, say because the parent is abusive or neglectful. The parent is not occupying her role as a parent. But still, the trust-based nature or character of the parental role gives the parent a reason to do what a parent should do, should be trusted by their child to do. Okay, now on to trust and authority. There are scholars who cast their analyses of the place of social and political trust, including trust in institutions, in democratic societies, in terms of a choice between trust and rule by force or compulsion. I think this sort of analysis is reductive. Why? Because it disregards the fundamental difference signaled and explained by scholars such as Max Weber, Peter Winch, Herbert Hart, Joseph Raz, and many others before and since, between naked power on the one hand, or coercion, and authority on the other hand. So if we bring authority into the equation, it becomes easier to see, I think, that trust may not be, as Professor Loughlin hinted earlier, a distinctive feature of successful democracies. It may just as well be a useful tool for authoritarian regimes who rule on the basis of coercion and sub-rational forms of influence, rather than on the basis of rational engagement of public reason and recognition of the dignity and equal moral status of the members of the community. Moreover, it may very well be, as some have suggested as well, that democratic politics is vulnerable to certain forms of wrongful manipulation. It may very well be. And if that is the case, I think, then the choice cannot be cast simply in terms as one between trust and coercion. So if I am suggesting we accept that trust is a reason-giving attitude or relationship, then it is worth comparing and contrasting it with the sort of reason-giving that authority provides. So some scholars conceptualize trust as a three-place relation, as Lina mentioned earlier as well, A trust, B to phi. Authority is similar. On Joseph Raz's view, account of the logic of authority, which I'll roughly follow here, although there are many others, reasons of authority are exclusionary. And by exclusionary, he means a hybrid of a first-order reason to phi and a second-order reason not to phi for other reasons. However, authorities have limited jurisdiction, and not all reasons are excluded by the issuing of a particular directive. The limited jurisdiction of authority, I think, makes its structure similar to that of trust as a three-place relation. So, for example, I trust Maria to drive me safely and punctually to the airport, but not necessarily to cook a delicious gourmet meal for 10 people. Right? So despite the similarity between authority and trust, trusting someone is different from recognizing their authority. From the point of view of authority, of course, it really is irrelevant why the addressee of a directive follows or obeys the directive. It is possible for A to have authority over B when B follows or complies with her directives merely out of fear or laziness rather than a belief in her legitimacy, right? De facto authority, defined as a belief in legitimate authority, and legitimate authority, which is justified authority, are distinct. And a parallel distinction, it seems to me, is that between reliance and trust. For example, I can rely on my bookcase to withstand the weight of my books, but it would be a bit strange to say that I trust my bookcase. Equally, I can rely on my neighbor's routine to know what time it is, but it would equally be very strange to say that I trust my neighbor to ensure that I get to a meeting on time. So I think de facto authority stands for reliance, as legitimate authority stands for trust. Okay. So I'll move on to the third part of my remarks. What do I mean by a thick account of trust? So what I have just said about the reasons of trust and the reasons of authority leads to what I call a thick account of trust. I apologize, I didn't address the question, which I think is very important but impossible to address here, which is the question whether reasons of trust are exclusionary. I think they're not, but I can't develop that argument here. So please bear with me as I move on to the thick account. So what I've just said about the reasons of authority leads to what I call a thick account of trust. And by thick, I mean roughly what Bernard Williams had in mind when he introduced the distinction between thick and thin concepts. A thick view of trust, or a thick concept of trust, if you like, is one which is both descriptive and evaluative. Right? But there is another element to the idea of thick trust, of a thick account that I have in mind. And it is that such an account seeks to understand and reproduce the normative viewpoint of the parties in the trust relationship. That is, the reasons for action or belief that trust gives them. I think we need a thick account of trust if we want to explain the behavior of individuals or groups in relation to political institutions. Why? Because such behavior, it seems to me, is guided by standards, if we want to call them norms, and influenced by attitudes which are formed in a context in which there is a legitimate expectation of commitment and responsiveness. We need to identify such standards and attitudes in order to determine whether, and if so, which reasons of trust are at stake. Only by identifying the reasons of trust that apply to the parties in a particular relationship is it possible to assess whether trust has been betrayed. And of course, the logically prior question is whether there was trust in the first place. There can be no betrayal without trust. So on this account, trusting entails vulnerability and risk-taking on the part of the person who trusts, and discretion on the part, by the trusted party. A person who trusts is vulnerable both to betrayal and to a possible mismatch between her wishes and what the trusted party does. A judge has once said that the court sometimes rightly does exactly what the public does not want. Being trusted entails being relied upon to exercise one's own judgment as to how to do what one is trusted to do, which brings to mind John Bercow's farewell speech in 2019 when he left the House of Commons. At one point he said, we come here not as delegates, but as representatives. And I think this is quite suggestive of this idea of the exercise of judgment by the trusted party. Trust is also a relationship, and it's a three-place relation, as we've said before. It entails commitment, responsiveness, mutual recognition, reciprocity, actual or legitimately expected. Trust is also both a cognitive and an affective attitude. Breaches of trust are forms of betrayal, not just disappointment. Trust can be resistant to evidence of untrustworthiness, and it is highly context-dependent. And in its behavioral dimension, trust can also be studied as a normative social practice. Okay, so what is trust not, according to this thick account? Trust is not mere reliance, as we've seen with the example of the bookcase and the neighbor's routine. Trust is not mere probabilistic reasoning about what someone will do. It can coexist with and be resistant to evidence of untrustworthiness. Trust is not a mere prediction. It gives the trusted party discretionary power over what to do, to an extent, and how to do it. Trust is not a belief, or not merely a belief, in someone's trustworthiness. It can coexist with an absence of such a belief. Okay, it's true, I cannot simultaneously trust and not trust someone, but I can trust someone in the absence of a belief in their trustworthiness. They're different things. Trust is not hope or faith. It is rooted, rather, in a belief in the other party's responsiveness to certain reasons. It is not beguilement. It is both rooted in reasons and reason-giving. Trust and the use of the language of trust should not be confused. Using the language of trust can be a way of manifesting actual trust or trust responsiveness, but it can also be a purely rhetorical device, a way of misleading someone into trusting. Trust is not an act of will. It is not possible, I think, to decide to trust. One either trusts or doesn't trust another. Trusting cannot be willed, just as belief or emotion cannot be willed. The attitude of trust is separable, I think, conceptually, from possible acts of trust or entrusting. So I hope to have given you a quick glimpse of into why I think we should look at trust in the thick sense as an attitude, both cognitive and affective, and a relationship or practice. But trust can also be a virtue, both moral and epistemic. And it won't be possible to develop an argument as to why here, but let me introduce the idea, if I still have some minutes, by relating trust with another familiar virtue, the virtue of the rule of law. And I'll be very brief. Okay, so the virtue of the rule of law gives life within a legal order, if you like, the kind of stable predictability that makes coordination of social life possible. Now, this is common knowledge, by preventing arbitrariness in the use of power, at least some instances of arbitrariness in the use of power. It enhances individual autonomy, so some accounts go, in the face of threats to it that the very existence of a legal order creates, right? So what, if anything, can trust add to the rule of law picture of the relationship between citizens and the institutions that regulate political communities through law? Perhaps meeting rule of law requirements makes institutions more likely to earn the trust of the members of the political community. Perhaps. Maybe trust in institutions makes those who act in their name more likely to meet the requirements of the rule of law in the way they act. Maybe. But these are empirical questions, right? That social scientists and social psychologists are better equipped than I am to address. It is not a conceptual question. The value of the rule of law lies, in part, in its autonomy-enhancing potential, right? And it is interesting to note, I think, that the capacity for trust, too, is autonomy-enhancing. I am all the more autonomous for being capable of trusting others and for being able to withhold trust when such withholding is apt. Many of us have a sense that trust, when warranted and deeply rooted, is very valuable. Respect for the predictability and certainty-enhancing requirements of the rule of law by public institutions and legal officials can contribute to a deeply rooted culture of trust in public life. Denmark, I think, is a case in point. And a lot of work, of course, has been done by scholars across the disciplines to understand how trust can enhance social life and democratic participation. But I think more work needs to be done to understand if, and if so, why, trust can be both instrumentally and intrinsically valuable. And we cannot answer these questions unless we clarify what distinctive reasons for action and belief trust gives us as individuals and as members of political communities. We need to identify and understand the reasons of trust. So let me briefly, to finish, zoom in on the judicial branch, about which I've been thinking a bit in the last couple of years, and the role of courts in protecting or promoting the rule of law. The rule of law, again, is the ideal according to which it is the law that rules, and the law rules through rules and rulings. It would be imprudent to ignore the fact that the rule of law largely depends on the willingness of ordinary people, as well as political actors, right, and institutions, to abide by court rulings. Such a willingness to accept the practical authority of judicial rulings may either be dependent on or enhanced by trust. Again, this is an empirical question. But here is a hypothesis to test, and this I leave to you for thinking about, in an account of the role of interpretation in adjudication, in judicial decision-making. There are two different kinds of asymmetry, one could say, between courts and the addressees of their judgments or rulings. There is a practical kind of asymmetry and an epistemic kind of asymmetry. Epistemic asymmetry, it could be said, gives rise to a judicial duty to interpret. That is understood as to explain legal meaning, right, in the process of resolving a case. The duty to interpret is subsidiary to the duty to justify judicial decisions. And in the exercise of their duty to interpret, which is a condition of their duty to give reasons for their decisions, courts give addressees of their rulings reasons for belief in the correctness of their interpretive conclusions. They also give them reasons, of course, to abide by their rulings. We could see, my suggestion is that we see interpreting as a form of telling or testimony, which invites the trust of the addressees of judicial decisions. And it is interesting then to think about the implications of this, because eliciting or inviting trust has salient moral implications, which take us back to the reasons of trust. Are such reasons of trust to be added to the reasons of authority that courts give us? This is one way in which I think reasons of trust can be connected with the question of with a big question in constitutional theory, of where interpretation ends and political judgment begins. It is one angle from which I think we can think about reasons of trust in an account of the limits and of the limits of constitutional review in particular, and the place of interpretation in it. I think there would be room within such an account for exploring differences between the virtues of trust and the rule of law, as well as the ways in which the promotion or the undermining of one of these virtues enhances or undermines or weakens the other. So I leave you with the following question to think about. In a healthy constitutional democracy, based on the ideal of the rule of law, what place is there for trust beyond a catalogue of conditions of for legitimate authority? I think making progress in exploring the theme of this conference depends on asking such questions and attempting to address them on the basis of some view of the reasons of trust, one by one. Then I think we can move on to more, further empirical work and normative theory. But one thought seems quite promising at the outset, and that's the thought that trust and trustworthiness are as much virtues of individuals as they are of institutions. Thank you.